Winter fell over Hollow Creek like a hush over an untold prayer. Snow sifted through the gray dawn, powdering the roofs, swallowing the sound of wheels and slowing time itself. Inside the town's small hospital, barely more than a converted schoolhouse, the only warmth came from the soft whir of a heart monitor and the steady breathing of a German shepherd lying beside the man who refused to die. Elias Rowan had been a lawman once, the kind who carried silence better than a badge. Now silence carried him. Tubes and wires draped across his chest like pale winter vines, each one a fragile thread tying him to the world he no longer saw. 15 doctors had come and gone, each one leaving a note, a theory, and a quiet shake of the head. Whatever had settled inside him after that winter fire was beyond their reach. Ashen, his dog, didn't know words like terminal or failure. He only knew the sound of Elias's heartbeat, faint and irregular, like distant thunder fading over frozen plains. Every night he pressed himself against his master's side, nose nestled into the hospital blanket, eyes open and waiting. Nurses whispered it was unnatural. How still he sat, how he refused food unless placed beside the man he served. But there was something in that stillness, a sacred weight. On the 5th night of the first snow, Clara Wren arrived. She was not a doctor but a nurse newly transferred from a larger town, a woman whose gentleness was often mistaken for fragility. Her voice carried the warmth of distant hearths, and her presence softened even the sterile walls. When she first saw Elias, she paused. Something in his still face called to the quiet ache she carried in her own heart. "Is he gone?" she whispered to the head nurse. "Not yet," the older woman replied. "But sometimes mercy looks like letting go." Ashen's head lifted at that. His eyes, those deep amber lights, met Clara's. For a moment, she thought she heard something. Not a growl, but a warning. Don't say such things in front of him. Later that night, when the ward had settled into its ghostly rhythm of machines and muffled prayers, Clara lingered by Elias's bedside. Ashen stayed still, his breath fogging faintly against the cold window. The moonlight touched his fur, turning it to silver frost. "You're waiting for him," she said softly. "Aren't you?" Ashen blinked once, slow and certain. She smiled, though her throat ached. "Then we'll wait together." Days folded into each other like worn pages. Outside, the town gossiped. Some said the officer had angered God by saving that child from the burning cabin. Others said he'd traded his life for the boys. In a place as small as Hollow Creek, tragedy was never private. It was community entertainment, coded in sympathy and delivered with judgment. Inside the hospital, the world moved differently. Clara found herself reading aloud when the nights grew long. Old books left behind by patients, stories of redemption, whispered legends from the town's early days. She didn't expect anyone to listen, yet sometimes she thought she saw Elias's fingers twitch at certain words, as if trying to hold on to them. Ashen seemed to understand. Whenever her voice trembled, he inched closer, placing his head near her knee. The room felt less like a ward then, and more like a vigil, a small sanctuary built out of devotion and breath. One evening, Sheriff Harlan Pike came stomping through the corridor, snow dripping from his boots. "That dog's gotta go," he declared, stopping at the doorway. "Ain't right having an animal in intensive care." "Folks are starting to talk." Clara rose from her chair, her hands trembling but steady in intention. "He's all that man has left." "Rules are rules," Pike said. "Can't bend 'em for a dog." Ashen stood then, silent, muscles tensing under his winter coat. His gaze fixed on the sheriff. Not aggressive, not fearful, just steady. The kind of look that made men reconsider their authority. Pike cleared his throat, muttered something about returning in the morning, and left. The door closed softly behind him, leaving the faint scent of cold air and shame. Clara knelt beside Ashen. "We'll find a way," she whispered. That night, she smuggled him in through the side entrance after the lights dimmed. His nails clicked softly on the tiled floor as he followed her to Elias's room. The moment he climbed back onto the bed beside his master, the monitors steadied. His heartbeat found a rhythm again, faint but true. Clara froze. "It's like he knows," she murmured. Ashen didn't move, didn't blink, only pressed closer, syncing his breathing with Elias's. From that night onward, Clara stopped fighting the mystery and began to believe in it. She spoke less to the doctors and more to the man who could not reply. She told him about her days, the way the frost etched lace patterns on the window, the way the town smelled of pine smoke, how loneliness sounded when the wind swept through empty streets. Sometimes she caught herself confessing things she'd never said aloud. How she'd once loved someone who left, how she'd buried her mother without anyone beside her, How she came to Hollow Creek to start over, but didn't know what that meant anymore. Elias's face never changed, yet there were moments, barely perceptible, when she thought his lashes fluttered at her words. "Maybe you can hear me," she whispered one dawn, as the world turned the color of pewter. "Maybe you're waiting for someone to tell you it's all right to come back." Ashen lifted his head then, as if agreeing. Days deepened into weeks. Snow layered over the town, softening everything except the whispers. The hospital staff grew used to Clara's late-night vigils. Some found it touching. Others pitied her, but no one could deny that something in that room had changed. The air felt different, thicker, quieter, as if holding its breath. One afternoon, while checking Elias's vitals, Clara felt the faintest brush of movement beneath her fingers. His hand twitched once, then stilled again. She froze, pulse racing. "Elias," she breathed, barely daring to hope. Nothing, only the slow beep of the monitor. Yet she couldn't shake the sense that something unseen had shifted, like the ground beneath the snow warming with the promise of spring. Later, she sat by the window, watching the sky fade into evening. "If faith is foolish," she said softly, "then maybe I'm a fool." Ashen rested his muzzle on her lap, eyes half closed. Together they watched the falling snow. On the 29th night, a storm swept through Hollow Creek. The power flickered. Shadows stretched across the ward. Clara stayed by Elias's bed, her lantern burning low. Outside, the wind howled through the eaves like a wounded thing. When the power finally cut out, silence swallowed everything. She reached for the lantern, but before she could, she felt something. A faint pressure against her wrist. She looked down. Elias's fingers were curled around her sleeve. His hand trembled, weak but deliberate. Tears blurred her vision. "Elias, you're here." His eyes didn't open, but his lips parted slightly. A whisper of breath escaping, no words, just the raw sound of life trying to return. Ashen whimpered softly, pushing his nose into Elias's palm. The man's fingers moved again, this time to touch the dog's fur. A weak pulse stirred beneath the skin. In the darkness, Clara pressed her forehead to the back of his hand. "Stay with us," she whispered. "Please." The generator hummed back to life moments later, flooding the room with pale light. Machines beeped softly, rhythm steadying. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, something had changed. The air, the light, the way time itself seemed to pause. When dawn came, the snow had buried the roads, silenced the town, and painted the world in shades of white. Clara hadn't slept. She sat by Elias's side, exhaustion and awe mingling in her chest. Ashen's head rested on the bed, eyes half closed, his breathing slow and even. For the first time in months, Elias's color looked less like winter and more like dawn. Clara leaned close, voice barely a breath. "We're not done yet." And though no one else could have heard it, Ashen's tail brushed faintly against the blanket like a quiet promise. Outside, the bells of Hollow Creek rang faintly through the snow, each note slow and hollow, as if marking not an ending, but the beginning of something awakening beneath the ice. The world held its breath, waiting for what came next. Snow muffled the world into silence that morning, the kind of silence that comes after loss, thick and unyielding. Sheriff Callan Reeves lay motionless on the cot inside his frost-bitten cabin, breath shallow, the color drained from his lips. The doctors had already left 2 nights ago. Their verdict whispered with the finality of winter's wind. "There's nothing more we can do." Yet in the corner, beside the dying embers of the fire, a pair of amber eyes still burned with life. Ash, the black and silver shepherd, hadn't moved from his master's side. He watched each faltering breath like a prayer he refused to let die. The storm outside howled like a wounded soul. Callan's fever had worsened, his pulse faint, his body trembling beneath a threadbare blanket. The townsfolk had given up hope, whispering over fences that the sheriff's end had come at last. To them, he was a relic of an old era, a man who'd seen too much blood, carried too much guilt. But Ash didn't believe in endings, only in waiting. He had been with Callan since the day they both pulled each other out of ruin. Loyalty for him wasn't a word, it was breath. At dawn the dog stirred. His ears twitched toward something unseen, an instinctual pull. He pressed his muzzle against Callan's hand, whining softly, then darted toward the door. When Callan didn't move, Ash clawed at the wood, growling low, urgent. The latch snapped open from his weight, and the freezing wind poured in, scattering snowflakes across the floor like white petals on a grave. Ash ran. He moved through the blizzard as if guided by something ancient, his paws bleeding, nose low to the ground. The town lay distant, shrouded in the pale mist of early morning. People barely noticed the dark shape weaving through alleys until he burst through the door of the old doctor's shack at the edge of town. Dr. Alaric Poe, once Callan's oldest friend before years of silence separated them, nearly dropped his lamp when he saw the dog wild-eyed, coated in frost. "Ash," he murmured. The shepherd barked once, sharp and pleading, then turned toward the door, glancing back with desperate insistence. Alaric hesitated, but something in those eyes, an echo of duty, of friendship long buried, pulled him out into the cold. By the time they reached the cabin, the fire had long died. Callan's body was still, the room heavy with the chill of surrender. But Alaric, trembling, moved fast. He noticed something the others had missed. A faint bluish streak beneath the sheriff's ribs, hidden under layers of bruising. Snakebite. Not fever, not plague. The venom had slowed, thickened by the cold, but hadn't finished its course. Ash sat nearby, watching, as Alaric set to work with trembling hands. His old training returned in bursts, the rhythm of compressions, the mixing of heated water, the careful drawing of the last vial of anti-venom he'd kept for emergencies. Hours passed unnoticed. Only the sound of Ash's breathing and the faint whisper of Alaric's prayers filled the cabin. When Callan's eyes fluttered open, it was as if dawn had cracked through storm clouds. His voice was weak, barely audible. "They said I wouldn't." Alaric leaned close, eyes wet with relief. "You never were one to listen." Ash let out a low whine and pressed his muzzle against Callan's arm. The sheriff smiled faintly, his fingers twitching to scratch the fur between the dog's ears. The firelight caught the moment like a painting, two men and a dog, bound not by words but by endurance, words spread by dusk. The sheriff had lived. Folks came in quiet disbelief, their whispers shifting from pity to awe. Some called it a miracle. Others said the dog had been sent by God himself. Yet Callan, weak but alive, knew better. The miracle wasn't in surviving. It was in being found. Days turned to weeks. The storm passed, leaving behind a white silence and roads lined with thawing ice. Callan slowly regained his strength, though the world seemed different now, softer, like the edge of a dream. He often caught himself watching Ash sleep by the fire, his chest rising and falling in rhythm with the crackling wood. Alaric stayed longer than he planned, repairing both the sheriff's body and the quiet distance between them. In the evenings, they'd sit outside the cabin, wrapped in blankets, speaking in murmurs about years gone by. The battles fought, the people lost, the weight they'd carried in silence. One night, as the northern lights shimmered faintly across the sky, Callan spoke. "Funny, isn't it? How the ones who save us can't speak our language." Alaric smiled faintly. "Maybe they don't need to." The words lingered like mist over snow, but the tale didn't end with healing. It ended with choice. Weeks later, when spring's first thaw touched the valley, the sheriff rode into town for the first time since his near death. The townsfolk paused in their chores, staring at him as though a ghost had returned. Beside his horse trotted Ash, proud and alert. Callan dismounted outside the saloon, his eyes scanning faces that once whispered pity. A hush fell as he spoke. Steady, deliberate. "The storm taught me something," he said quietly. "You don't survive alone. You endure because someone, refuses to let you fade." For a long moment, no one moved. Then old Mrs. Tessa, the apothecary's widow, raised her trembling hand and said softly, "We were wrong about you, Sheriff." Callan smiled faintly. "We've all been wrong before." That night he returned to his cabin. Ash lay by the hearth, tail thumping gently. Colin knelt beside him, whispering, "You knew. You always knew." The dog blinked, eyes glinting like twin embers. Outside, the last of the snow melted beneath the stars, and somewhere in that quiet thaw, forgiveness took root, in hearts, in memories, in the soil itself. The narrator's voice softens, almost breaking through time. Sometimes, salvation comes on four legs, wearing silence as its gift. Sometimes what the doctors miss, love remembers. The fire fades, the night deepens, and the whisper of the tale lingers, gentle, resolute, like the breath of winter exhaled for the last time. If this story found you tonight, if it warmed something long cold inside you, then stay a little while longer. There are more whispered tales yet to tell. Don't forget to subscribe for the next Ember in the Dark.